He went 10-7, and somebody wants to hand him a trophy for it. Miss me with that. Because if going 10-7 earns you Coach of the Year, then let me introduce you to a coach who's been doing that exact thing for damn near 2 decades and never once got the call. Before we get into this, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to be here for what's coming this season. So here's the deal. There's this take floating around football media right now, and honestly, it's one of the wildest ones I've heard all offseason. The argument being made is that Pittsburgh's new head coach deserves a serious Coach of the Year buzz simply for matching last year's 10-7 record. Just matching it, not improving on it, not making a leap, just running it back to the exact same number. And look, I get why people want to hype up a fresh era in Pittsburgh. There's a new voice in the building, a new offensive identity, a Super Bowl winning resume walking through the door. But are we really just handing out Coach of the Year nominations like participation trophies now? Because if a 10-7 record alone is enough to get you into that conversation, then the previous Pittsburgh coach should have a case full of those awards collecting dust. He'd have 7, 8 of them stacked up in a display case somewhere, because that coach delivered that exact record, or better, over and over and over again for the better part of 2 decades and never sniffed the honor. So naturally, I got curious. Has anyone ever actually won Coach of the Year with a 10-7 record? I went and dug through the history books so you don't have to. And the answer is more complicated than you'd think, but it teaches you exactly what this award is really about. A few years back, a first-year head coach took over the New York Giants and led them to a stunning turnaround season, finishing 9-1. Sorry, let me be precise. It was a phenomenal bounce-back campaign that got him a well-deserved Coach of the Year nod. Go back even further, into the 90s, and you'll find a coach who won the award with an actual losing record. 7 wins, 9 losses, and he still walked away with the hardware. Sounds insane on paper, right? And if you scan through the last 20, 30 years of award history, you'll spot a handful of coaches who captured it with records hovering around 10 wins and 6 losses. Here's the common thread, though, and it's the part that actually matters. Every single one of those cases involved a dramatic turnaround story. These were coaches inheriting teams that were an absolute disaster the year before, teams that had no business sniffing the playoffs, and just getting back to respectability was treated as a miracle. That Giants team was putrid before their new coach walked in. Go from garbage to the playoffs in year 1. Sure, that's award-worthy. That coach from the 90s inherited a Cowboys team that had basically nothing going for it before he arrived. So climbing to 7-9 looked like turning water into wine. And there's a case involving a Saints coach taking over a franchise that had been dreadful for the better part of its entire existence. Not just a bad year, a bad decade, and getting them to 10-6 with a legitimate playoff berth. There was also an emotional, city-healing storyline wrapped into that one that added extra weight to the narrative. None of that applies here. None of it. Pittsburgh went 10-7 last season already. That's not a rock-bottom situation being rescued. That's the floor. That's the standard. In fact, if this team goes 10-7 again this year, that should be viewed as a disappointment, not an accomplishment, because on paper, the roster is significantly better than it was a year ago. The old coaching staff got a division title out of a lesser roster last season. So if this new staff matches that exact number with more talent at their disposal, that's not a leap forward. That's treading water. For this new coach to genuinely be in the Coach of the Year conversation, the bar has to be higher than repeating history. We're talking taking this team from 10-7 to something like 12 wins, 5 losses, winning the division comfortably, getting this roster over a hump that the previous regime couldn't quite clear in years past. That's the actual pathway to the award, elevating the ceiling, not matching the floor. Now here's where it gets interesting, and here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why is there this widespread belief that simply matching last year's record would even be considered a big accomplishment in the first place? The only way that logic holds up is if you believe the rest of the AFC North has suddenly become dramatically better than Pittsburgh. So let's actually examine that, because the betting markets and a lot of media coverage are leaning hard into that exact narrative right now. Let's start with the team getting genuine buzz for a bounce-back campaign built around health and defensive improvements. That's a fair storyline. A talented quarterback finally staying on the field for a full season changes everything, and there's been real investment on the defensive side. But that's still an if. A big if. That defense has underwhelmed no matter who's been running it the past few seasons, and quarterback health is never a guarantee in this league. Promising storyline, sure, but far from a lock. Then there's the division favorite. And this is where things get genuinely baffling. Sportsbooks aren't just picking this team to win the division. They've got them favored to represent the entire conference. Think about that for a second. Are people forgetting who actually won the AFC North last season? Pittsburgh did, with a roster that, by most accounts, was inferior to what this new-look Baltimore area contender is bringing into the season. Not only did Pittsburgh win the division, they swept their biggest rival, beat them twice, including a win in Week 18 showdown with the division on the line. And it's not like that rival got significantly better this offseason either. If anything, they lost major pieces. Their star center left in free agency for a massive contract elsewhere. Their standout tight end also walked in free agency. Their franchise quarterback, as dynamic as he still is, isn't getting any younger or more mobile. We've watched his game evolve into more of a pure passer, which is a nice development, but it's not the same explosive, game-breaking dual threat he was in his MVP seasons. He's still comfortably a top 4 or top 5 quarterback in this league, no argument there. But he was that exact same caliber of player last season too, and it still wasn't enough to get past Pittsburgh. Speaking of that Week 18 finale, Pittsburgh went into that game with a genuinely banged-up future Hall of Fame quarterback, missing his top receiver, relying on a receiving core that most analysts would call middle-of-the-pack at best. And they still walked out of that building with the win, the sweep, and the division crown. Meanwhile, this offseason, Pittsburgh has upgraded nearly every single position group on the roster. At quarterback, there's real continuity now. A full offseason with the same signal caller and a coaching staff that has a track record of getting the absolute best out of him. That quarterback-coach pairing alone should be considered a legitimate upgrade over what was running the offense a year ago. In the backfield, there's a genuine two-headed attack now with fresh legs added to the room. At receiver, there's more proven talent added to pair with the #1 target. And losing an underperforming tight end from the rotation should actually be addressed as an upgrade, not a downgrade. It opens up snaps for younger, more dynamic pass catchers who were previously buried on the depth chart. The offensive line is entering its prime window. And defensively, the secondary got a serious talent infusion, multiple new cornerbacks added, a safety returning from injury, a star defensive back sliding into a new role that should maximize his versatility. One of the linebackers is entering the absolute prime of his career, and there's real reason to expect a monster year from another key defender given the scheme fit with the new defensive coordinator. The defensive line, when you count it up, is 5 or 6 players deep with legitimate starting caliber talent. So walk me through the logic again. Why exactly is the division rival getting all this preseason praise when they aren't even the reigning division champions? And Pittsburgh has gotten stronger everywhere, while they've actually lost significant pieces. Yes, they added a marquee pass rusher this offseason, and that's a real, tangible improvement. No argument there. But outside of that one signing, there are still aging names scattered across that defense, a defense that, frankly, wasn't even good last season. The receiver room still hasn't been meaningfully addressed, and we just went through the list of significant subtractions this team suffered in free agency. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh is stacked from top to bottom. Now, I'll be honest, I've said some version of this exact sentiment for the past 3 or 4 off-seasons in a row, and at some point you start sounding like a broken record. But there's something different in the air this time. There's a genuinely new coaching philosophy, a shift toward prioritizing the offensive side of the ball, and a completely different allocation of resources than we've seen in years past. That combination gives real, tangible reason for optimism heading into this season. So if the rest of the football world wants to crown someone else the off-season division champion or conference favorite, that's honestly fine by me. Let them have the spotlight and the pressure. Flying under the radar has worked out just fine before. Now here's your question of the day, and I genuinely want to hear where you land on this one down in the comments. Do you think this new coach deserves to be seriously considered for Coach of the Year purely from matching last year's record, or does that talk need to be earned with actual improvement on the field? Drop your take below, because I know this one is going to be split right down the middle. Alright, shifting gears completely, because there's a milestone worth revisiting. It's officially been a full year since one of the most talked about trades in recent franchise history went down, And with that anniversary hitting, a lot of football outlets are circling back to grade it now that we have an entire season of results to actually judge it on. Let's rewind and set the stage. The trade sent a former All-Pro safety, along with a 2027 fifth-round pick, out of Pittsburgh. In exchange, Pittsburgh received a star cornerback, a veteran tight end, and a 2027 seventh-round pick coming back the other way. So now that we've got a full season of tape on how these players performed in their new homes, the obvious questions have to be asked. Who actually won this trade? What grade would you slap on it? And knowing what we know now, would you run it back exactly the same way? Here's my honest breakdown. I think Pittsburgh won this trade, though depending on how you want to frame it, you could make a case it was closer to a wash. It really comes down to the headline names on each side. I believe the cornerback Pittsburgh acquired outperformed the safety they gave up, and I think we saw that play out over the course of the season. Now, to be fair, the safety had a strong individual season in his return to his previous team, but that team didn't even keep him beyond this past year. He's already been moved on from, and is now playing for a completely different franchise. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh still has their guy, and there's real hope he can anchor that secondary for several more seasons, potentially recapturing that late career dominance we've seen from elite defensive backs who found a second wind with a new franchise. Time will ultimately be the judge of that, but based purely on last season's tape, the cornerback was the more impactful piece for his new defense than the safety was for his old one. Rewind the clock a few years, and maybe that argument flips, but right now, in the current version of both of these guys' careers, I'll take the cornerback every time. More versatile, and I'd bet on him having more staying power at a high level. But that's not the entire story of this deal, because the tight end who came over in the same trade complicates the whole picture. You could genuinely argue he was a net negative for the offense. His presence on the field took snaps and opportunities away from a promising young tight end already on the roster, and it also limited the development of another rising offensive weapon. And it's not like his individual production justified those lost opportunities. By most accounts, he was a real letdown given the hype surrounding his arrival. Expectations were sky-high heading into that trade because the team had just moved on from a disgruntled star receiver and desperately needed another dynamic weapon. The hope was this tight end, fresh off a career-best season with his previous team, would slot in as this versatile chess piece, someone who could line up in line, split out wide, work the slot, give the offense a whole new dimension. It was going to be fun watching the coaching staff get creative finding ways to get him the ball. Instead, when you actually look at his snap counts and his overall production across the year, it's hard not to conclude the trade would have been better off without him entirely. He took more away from that offense than he ultimately gave back, especially when you consider what the young tight end already in the building could have done, arguably would have done, with those same opportunities. So if you're asking whether I'd redo this trade exactly as it happened, honestly, no. I'd keep the safety for cornerback swap, no question, but I'd surgically remove the tight end from the deal entirely. Just do a straight-up one-for-one, safety for cornerback, and use that extra draft capital elsewhere. Maybe package it toward finally addressing the receiver need that went unsolved for the entire season. As constructed, with everything included, I'd grade this trade something like a solid B. Strip out the tight end, and just do the core swap. That climbs to an A-, maybe even a flat A. As this trade continues to age, I think the verdict leans further in Pittsburgh's favor, mainly because they still have their best player from the deal locked in, while the other side has already moved on from theirs entirely and never got the offensive piece to work out either. Call it a slight edge, maybe leaning toward a wash if you want to be conservative about it, but I'm comfortable saying Pittsburgh got the better end of the best players involved. So that's the full breakdown. The Coach of the Year debate that honestly doesn't hold up under any real scrutiny once you look at the history books. The reasons this division rival is getting way more hype than their actual roster changes justify, and a full season grade on one of the most significant trades this franchise has made in years. Let me know your thoughts on absolutely everything covered here. The Coach of the Year debate, the division odds, and how you'd grade that trade 1 year later. Drop it all in the comments. Hit that like button if this broke down the offseason the way you wanted, and I'll see you in the next one.